Welcome, students. Now, in this lesson, we're going to review the first people to exist upon the American continent, the Native Americans. Before we can begin truly examining the history of the United States, we must first discuss the three converging cultures meeting within the Americas. The first of which are those persons who already resided upon this continent before the arrival of the Europeans on this soil. So without further ado, the Native Americans. First things first, let's get some terminology out of the way. The first people to inhabit North and South America are the Native Americans. The name sounds Native Americans, those native to the Americas. Now, the term Native Americans was introduced in the 1990s, so there are several other terms that exist that describe the same group of people. Some textbooks, especially older textbooks, will refer to them either as Indians or American Indians. Now, many who are more pro-Native American rights will often use the term First Nations or First Peoples to describe the Native Americans, since their political entities, their nations, were the first nations upon the American continent. But nonetheless, if you see any of these terms, Native Americans, Indians, American Indians, or First Nations, they are referring to the same group of people. Paleolithic Native Americans. So during the last Ice Age, human beings first crossed the Bering Land Bridge that existed between what is now Russia and Alaska. Now, they did this for the purposes of following the herds of megafauna. Megafauna are the large, now extinct animals of the late Pliocene epoch. That is to say, the big animals of the last Ice Age. Things like woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, aurochs, which are a type of wild bull. Things of that nature. Now, once they crossed the Bering Land Bridge into what is now Alaska, these people began to move southward and eastward in search of warmer climates and greener grasslands. So it's quite interesting that while we often think of America as a story of westward expansion, the original settling of these two continents was actually a story of eastward expansion. So the Mayans. Now, the Mayans are one of the earliest advanced civilizations to emerge in the Americas, and they emerge in Central America. That's the part of the peninsula where Mexico meets South America. That whole peninsula, that's Central America. Now, it's in where Nicaragua and countries like that are today. So now they built temple complexes with massive step pyramids. The Mayans also created an advanced calendar that could predict astronomical events several centuries in advance. Now, the original Mayan calendar actually did not include any leap years, so despite all the hype you may have heard when you were younger about 2012 and the end of the world, Mayan 2012 actually passed away without any fanfare in the 1980s. What is interesting of note is that the Mayans were able to create a calendar that could predict solar and lunar eclipses thousands of years in advance. Most likely the reason their calendar ended was that they intended to later create another one when they got closer to the end of the first one, and their civilization simply never lasted long enough to make that happen. Now, they had a polytheistic religion, that's a religion with multiple gods, and they had written language. So the Inca. The Inca were an incredibly advanced civilization in what is now the Andes Mountains. They often had massive gold and silver mines. Their buildings were earthquake-proof despite using no mortar. So they actually cut the stones so precisely that they fit together like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And as a result of this, the building will not collapse even in an earthquake. They practiced terrace farming since they settled their cities on top of mountains. They would cut terraces into the side of mountains and hills so there would be flat spaces on which they could grow their crops. Similar to many other great civilizations, like the Romans, the Inca had an extensive road network, which was vital for bureaucratic and military communication across the empire. Now, what's very interesting is that the Inca used a system of knot-based record keeping. So they actually didn't have what we would consider a typical written language. They kept financial records through a series of knots tied in rope. But it's not what many would consider a traditional writing source, which raises some interesting historical debates as to whether or not you can classify the Incan as a civilization or not, since they lack a writing system which many consider a prerequisite for civilization status. So the Aztecs. Now the Aztecs were also an advanced civilization in modern-day Mexico. Their capital city was Tenochtitlan, and it sits where modern-day Mexico City exists. Now, the Aztecs believed that they originated at the base of a lake, or an underground tunnel network, and that their people emerged from the earth and marched southward until they saw an eagle fighting a snake atop a cactus, and that there they decided to build their city. They used floating gardens in order to grow their food. They also had a polytheistic religion which featured human sacrifices, usually by means of the individual having their heart ripped out atop a step pyramid. Now, since people in the Americas did not keep crops, well, they have crops, but they did not keep farm animals, there was a lack of protein in the diet, so wealthy and well-to-do Aztecs would often consume the corpses of human sacrifices in acts of cannibalism. Now, sacrifice, especially human sacrifice, was so essential to the Aztec belief system that they actually would fight wars with people they'd already subjugated just so that they could get new prisoners for sacrifice. These are sometimes called flowery wars. And with that, that concludes our discussion of the civilizations native to the Americas before the arrival of the Europeans. Next installment, we will be looking at the Native Americans of North America in particular.